Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm Cipher, and this is the Devil's Advocate Debate Club. Welcome back, and welcome especially to Nervardia, an Australian friend of mine from on Twitter who recently did a video talking about how happy she was that Pastor Stephen Bannon, I believe is his name, was being banned from New Zealand. I had planned to do a scripted bit-by-bit response for all the places at which I disagree with her, and realized that it would have been far too long, potentially taking me several hours to record and many sessions on my phone and taking up the next several weeks of my uploads. So I'm just going to do an off-the-cuff response in the time that I have here, potentially with a part 2. First of all, who is Stephen Bannon, for any of you who don't know? See, I may have heard of him in the past, but it wasn't a name that I'd bothered to remember. He wasn't someone that I was particularly aware of until this video. And from her video, you can tell that he is a pastor who is hateful towards gay people and potentially genocidal towards them. I've looked into those claims, and they seem pretty much to be backed in truth. Ooh, looks like a egret over there. Anyway, though, so the more that I looked into Steve Bannon, the more it became clear that we weren't going to agree on anything. In fact, during my time researching him, I could not find a single statement that the man had made that I agreed with. I disagree with him on absolutely everything that I could actually find him saying. I never found him saying just simply, I should not have been banned from these countries, which is what I believe. He would always, give reasons or rhetoric behind it. So I literally could find nothing that I agree with the man on. He is a hateful, religious bigot who I'm about to give credit to that I can't give to most religious people. See, Steve Anderson, as far as I can tell, follows the Bible to the rules of God. So, part of the reason that I left the faith when I was quite young, in fact, when I read the Bible, was that there were a series of hypocrisies that no one could seem to bring together for me. One of those being that what God teaches you to do in the Bible and what Jesus teaches you to do are very different, conflict, and at times it can seem like Jesus had come to rewrite the Old Testament and, that none of that matters, but he actually explicitly says in several cases that this is not the case. However, as he preached tolerance and acceptance in the Old Testament, very, very explicitly outlined other ways to behave, it basically requires a cognitive dissonance among Christians, making it impossible for someone to follow both the Word of God and the Word of Jesus. I haven't personally found a Christian who succeeds actually in really following either one, but they tend to generally pick and choose bits from both and try to muddle them together. Where I'll give Pastor Steve Anderson credit is that he has not tried to muddle this. He has picked God's rules and is following them quite consistently. Now, this is something I'm completely against, as I found God's rules as laid out in most religions to be hateful and bigoted, but he is at least consistent. He also provides an amazing resource, I haven't used him yet, but I intend to, now that I'm aware of who he is, for when I'm arguing with theists online who say that things I'm pulling directly from the Bible are straw man fallacies and that I'm making them up and that no one really believes that way, but lo and behold, at least one church of people and a pastor with a certain amount of growing influence does. Let's talk about that growing influence, though, and the fact that I will now be more aware of, and, well, potentially even quoting Steven Anderson at times when I'm discussing things with theists. Because I would have never gotten to this point if it hadn't been for a video celebrating cancel culture and him being banned. Much like I had never heard of Alex Jones or paid any attention to who he was until he was banned at large from social media, at which point I started paying attention, and now go out of my way to watch him from time to time, not because I agree with him, but because I find him to be absolutely entertaining, and just his mannerisms and basically everything that he says. I actually really need to go. That reminds me, I need to go watch more Alex Jones, which is what this cancel culture really accomplishes. I mean, before he started getting banned from all of these countries, no one knew who Steve Anderson was or cared. Now he has a following in the theist community. Congratulations. In the beginning of her video, Nervardia, who, before I get any further into this, let me just say, I think Nervardia is wonderful. You should go subscribe to her channel. I disagree with most of what she says politically. The two of us get into debates all the time on Twitter, and she is absolutely fantastic, thoughtful, normally quite polite, a wonderful person, and worth subscribing to. However, I found her introduction in this video to be absolutely childish. I mean, sure, it can be funny at times, and she boos him basically immediately, but it goes beyond that. I don't remember any of my other specific examples, which is fine. I don't want to harp too long on somebody that I actually like, but I did find the video to be hard to watch and kind of disturbing just in the attitude, the otherization that was happening, because mentioned several times is the idea that, oh, well, New Zealand, especially after the Christchurch attacks, doesn't tolerate intolerance. Rowan Atkinson, a while back, did a bit on political correctness in which he talks about not tolerating intolerance. Oh, yes, sounds very wise. But if you think about it for more than 5 seconds, he goes on to say, you realize that it's just a different type of tolerance. You're replacing one intolerance with another. And so if you're not going to tolerate the intolerant, well, you'd better purge anyone who supported those laws. Which is always the joke, is, that the revolutionaries will be the first up against the wall when the revolution comes. Now, they're not exactly the first up against the wall in this case, but if you keep banning people for hate speech, eventually they'll come for you. Here's what I mean. Right now, this is something that we can all agree is fairly hateful. I'll discuss why I think it might not actually be hate speech in a minute, but if you're saying that you want to genocidally exterminate a group of people, for the most part, you hate them, right? Well, not necessarily. I mean, if you're just following the word of God and believe that you're carrying out the action, the will of an all-powerful creator being, you don't necessarily have to have any feelings whatsoever towards the group of people being exterminated. They've been othered by your beliefs to the point that they're no longer really human to you. So it's not necessarily hate, it's, well, something else. Whereas I think that if it can be argued, which I definitely think it can, that Steve Anderson hates gay people because he calls for their extermination, it could be argued that anyone who argues for people who believe what he does to be banned from their countries, and preferably banned from all countries, as we'll get to in a minute, that is hateful as well. You clearly hate Steve Anderson. I think I said Bannon a minute ago for some reason. But you clearly hate him and what he represents and don't want him in your country and would prefer that people like him not be around and that their ideologies be exterminated, if not, well, I mean, you at least believe that their ideologies should be exterminated when, as he points out multiple times throughout the video, all he's doing is preaching the word of God with less hypocrisy than most Christians. Now, I personally don't think that we should be following the rules laid out in the Bible. I think they're bigoted and hateful and exclusionary and quite often hypocritical. However, I think that people should definitely be able to preach their beliefs, because bringing us back to intolerance and the Christchurch shooter, mass shootings are, if you look into them statistically, separated into two categories: mass shootings and gang shootings. And there have been people of both political ideologies involved in both. But the one thing that is, as far as I've been able to tell, basically entirely consistent with people in the modern day who decide to go out and shoot at groups of other people outside of, family murder, suicides, and things like that. But any of these mass shootings and gang shootings, because a couple family suicides have actually been big enough to have technically accounted as a mass shooting. But with the exception of those, they're all motivated by one factor. Or at least, if they're not motivated by one factor, there's one shared factor. And it's not race, it's not political ideology. What it is that these people felt like they were not being heard, that they didn't have a place in society or a way to make an impact without going out and making something of themselves with violence. It's a way to get someone like the Christchurch shooter's beliefs out there. I mean, way more people read his manuscript. I actually haven't yet, but way more people have than would have if he'd just put it up on the web. He probably was banned from all kinds of places, where if he'd just been allowed to post his potentially hateful ideologies, people could have argued with him, talked him down. And yeah, a lot of people block people like that and refuse to interact with them, but that's why I'm completely against blocking people into dark corners. That's where hatred will fester. And blocking people from social media and banning them from visiting countries because of their ideologies is exactly what that is. She says several times throughout the video that we're not banning you, we're banning your ideas, we're banning what you have to say. Well, okay. To my knowledge, Australia and New Zealand, I've looked into this recently, both have hate speech laws which would prevent me from going there because I would be afraid that I would end up fined or thrown in prison for the things that I believe. For instance, I think that Black History Month is racist, and I think that we should fight against all racism. So I'm against Black History Month, and people will call me racist because of that. I think that they have internalized racism that they haven't been willing to look at, and that's why they support Black History Month. This is a belief that goes back to years when I was still a far leftist, Democrat-supporting Republicans are evil type because, well, someone laid it out to me in proper logic back in high school. But I've done a whole video on that. Regardless, these hate speech laws already exist, and if he's choosing to go to a country with these laws, there are certain things that he wouldn't be able to say there if you let him in. I mean, not without a fine or potential jail time in certain circumstances. So I would think it would be more important to make sure that he was following your hate speech laws and not preaching anything that broke them while in your country than it would be to ban him altogether, creating a somewhat legitimate feelings, I would think, of persecution, because he is being persecuted for taking a more literal interpretation of the Bible, whereas Christians like the Prime Minister of Australia, taking a more moderate, more hypocritical approach, are allowed to continue with what is, well, basically the same nonsense, or at least nonsense out of the same book, just picking and choosing the more palatable pieces of it. At one point, just getting into terminology here, there were several I wanted to go over. I don't know if I'll remember them all, but she does say that he's not a missionary. that, he considers himself a missionary, but he's not a missionary because what he's preaching is hate speech. Yes, but if it's in the Bible and he's out preaching the word of God, that does make him a missionary, even if it's hateful speech. And back to that idea of hate speech for a while, how long is it until a video celebrating someone being banned is the kind of thing that will get you banned? That is, in fact, hateful speech against that group. And just because his group is hateful, you feel protected to be hateful against them in the same way that the Christians felt protected to be hateful against gays until recent decades. You're just basically taking the pendulum and swinging it the other way as hard as you can. And personally, I find it disgusting. But that's because I believe in freedom of speech and freedom of expression, something which Nervardia will tell you she believes, but if you watch the video that I've linked in the description of my last video and that I'm responding to, she clearly does not. She likes freedom of expression when the things being said are things she likes, or things that she only moderately disagrees with. But anything strongly disagreed with enough to be considered or termed by her to be hateful, well, it's acceptable to censor that speech. And, not talking about direct calls to violence either, because when people talk about his quotes for gay genocide, I looked them up. What he's doing is quoting direct sections of the Bible that basically call for gay genocide, but he is pulling it straight out of the religious text. Speaking of terminology, another one she uses is sodomite, which is, she says, maybe if you don't want to be called hateful, you'll stop referring to gay people as sodomites. Now, I am one who is all for taking words literally, and that if something's literal interpretation isn't an insult, neither is the word for the most part. There are some exceptions to this, but few and far in between. Now, I definitely see why, from the religious perspective, or to someone in a religious community, sodomite would be an insult, but it just means someone who partakes in oral or anal sex. And I'm going to go ahead and guess that the very, very vast majority of people in the gay community do. Now, I suppose there are lesbians who don't like it, who just do strap-ons, and there may be asexual, male-partnered gay couples, but I just, from my experience, would say that they are few and far in between, and that the vast majority of gay people are, in fact, literally, by definition, sodomites. I'm not saying we have to take this as an insult, but when he says, by the Bible or God's definitions, these people are sodomites, he's not wrong. In fact, I think I found the one thing he's said that I agree with, because while I'm not saying that it's wrong or bad to be a sodomite, because I don't judge people for their sexuality or sexual choices, religious people do, he is right that by the God and the Bible's interpretation, and in fact, by the literal dictionary definition, most, if not all, gay people are sodomites. You don't have to take that as an insult, just as you pointed out that you don't take heathen as an insult, but a religious person or in a religious community, it is. If one religious person called another religious person a heathen, that's an insult. It's not an insult to the atheist community, who, as you've said, has accepted it and taken it as their own, but he wasn't really using it in the context shown in the video to be insulting. He would, or at least it didn't seem to be from my perspective, it seemed like he was speaking in what he felt to be factual. And if you don't follow God and tend to scoff at the rules and laws of God, like I do, then you're a heathen. And, you can take pride in that, but that doesn't mean that to really the majority of the world, since there are still way more theists than atheists, it's an insult. Arguing that it's not an insult just because one community has accepted it as their own is like arguing that Nazi isn't an insult because there are people out there who accept the term and the party themselves gave themselves that name. Which brings me to another part of her video when she clearly wants to call the guy, I'm assuming, a Nazi. But she doesn't say the word. She says, word I can't say on YouTube. Now, I think this is Nazi because that will get you deranked in the algorithms. And so a lot of people are shying away from saying words like that out of, I guess, cowardice. I don't see why else. She may have been trying to call him the F or N word, I suppose, but neither of them would have really made sense in context. So she wants to use a word because it expresses what she believes about Steve Anderson. Now, personally, I don't find the man to be a socialist. When I looked into it, it seems like he actually has a fairly strong support for capitalism. Be that what it may, he's just definitively not a Nazi. Just because Nazis were bad and hateful doesn't mean every bad and hateful person is a Nazi. Words mean something. However, I can't even be positive that I'm debating the right word, because rather than using the word she clearly wants to, she says, word I can't say on YouTube. This is what censorship is doing to us. This is why freedom of speech and expression is important, because when we start cutting off ideologies and even eventually words, it becomes harder to accurately express what we're trying to say. So I don't know if Nervardia was trying to call the man or not a Nazi or not. I know that that's an inaccurate description, but I can't see the F or N bombs being any more applicable and less so contextually. So this is just a perfect example in a video advocating for censorship of why we shouldn't have it. Back to the Alex Jones example, the best way for people who have, well, not even Alex Jones, but just back to Steve Anderson. The best way for people who have absolutely ridiculous, hateful ideas that the society at wide is going to scoff at, to be rebuked. The best way to deal with them is to let them speak their hateful ideas, to let people at large by the thousands say, no, that's not what we believe and you shouldn't either, and to tell them why, to engage with them, not to section them off into dark corners where they can be, where their hate can grow. God, I had something else too. Anyway, banning someone from all of these countries isn't going to send the message to them that the people, by and large, in these countries don't like them. There was no democratic vote. It was a decision made by a small group of people. And the people being banned realize this, so they don't see this as necessarily society at large disagreeing with them. They see this as persecution from power, because that's what it is. What we should let them do is speak their rhetoric in places where people will disagree with them, and maybe they'll change their ways. But if you're worried about them gaining a following, the best thing that you can do is ban and cancel them, because that's how half the people who know about people like Alex Jones and Steve Anderson even found out about them. So go ahead. Ban them from all the countries. Go ahead and do whatever you can to expand these people's reach, while at the same time doing whatever you can to push them into dark little corners where their hate can grow. But don't be surprised when it comes back to haunt you. Don't be surprised when your opinions are the next on the chopping block, or when people who feel like they've had no way to be heard come back and find a way to force the issue. So, I don't agree with Steve Anderson on much of anything. But I can't agree with Nervardia's assessments on him being a missionary, on heathen being an insult, on hate speech, or much else that she says in the video. I had other examples lined up here, but this is probably about the cutoff point for the memory on my phone. I probably won't do a follow-up for this. I think I covered all of the important points well enough, go follow Nervardia. And hey, if you make it to the end of this video, thanks for watching and listening to my opinions. It's something I really appreciate, is that we can disagree and continue engaging with each other. And if you do a response video, I promise I will script a response to it and get a proper debate going on the topic of censorship, if you would like, or really any other topic, as that's what my channel's for. But hello to Nervardia and any of her fans and followers who end up on this video. I am a fan myself. To everyone who watches my channel, I'm sorry that I've been a bit less prolific. I'm still struggling financially and have had to focus a bit more on getting the month's bills paid than on getting my channel in order as I had intended. However, I'm not going to let it stop me entirely. I just might have to cut back to videos once every week or two, as opposed to basically daily, until things are a little bit more settled. Thanks for bearing with me. And thank you all for watching. As always, I'm your host, Cipher. This has been the Devil's Advocate Debate Club. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and more importantly, leave a comment below and let me know what you think, because, well, this is all just my opinion. Have a good one.